Hey everybody, and welcome back to Professional Development, the New York City Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Noah, and today we will be exploring teacher shortage, both in terms of how it is discussed as a policy issue and how it impacts those of us who remain in the classroom when others leave, or never even arrive. We'll attempt to answer several guiding questions. First of all, is there a teacher shortage? What is it to be short-staffed at the school level, the district level, the state level, and nationally? Is the teacher shortage across all disciplines and licenses, or is it in specific subject areas only? Secondly, what or who causes teacher shortage? Is it that there are too few qualified teachers in the workforce, or is it that qualified teachers are leaving the classroom and heading into other jobs? In other words, is it that people are not joining the profession, or that they are joining and then leaving? Or is it a little bit of both? Thirdly, what are the implications for teachers in the classroom in the midst of a teacher shortage? Does the job get more difficult? Are there additional incentives to stay in the midst of this difficulty? What sorts of programs are implemented at the district, state, and national levels to help us out or attract more of us? Finally, we'll do some dreaming. We will attempt to solve the problems at the core of the teacher shortage and propose policy solutions that would nip the shortage in the bud, if only the higher-ups could afford our consulting fee of $3 per month at patreon.com/professionaldevelopment. Question number 1. Is there a teacher shortage? Well, first of all, what is a teacher shortage? The concept of teacher shortage entered the education conversation around the turn of the 21st century, as teachers of the baby boomer generation were beginning to retire, and experts were suggesting we would need an additional 200,000 teachers entering the profession every year to keep up with the growth of the student population. At the same time, decades-long battles against gender and racial barriers were opening up careers to women and people of color that had not previously been available. While teaching might have been an appealing career to their parents' generation, a younger generation was entering the workforce with more options and better prospects for pay and recognition. It turns out, the concern of policymakers in the early aughts was not misplaced, as teacher shortages have been a more or less nonstop issue in schools in the US. In 2019, the demand for teachers exceeded the supply nationwide by about 100,000 educators. The effects of teacher shortage are not felt the same way in every school, though. Teacher shortages are more common in low-income communities of color than in their whiter, more affluent neighboring communities. They also tend to be less about bodies and buildings and more about particular qualifications. In other words, a teacher shortage doesn't mean that kids will be in a classroom without a teacher, but that they might be taught in a math class by a social studies teacher. In 2008, for example, 16% of all core academic classes in grades 7 through 12 were taught by a teacher with neither a major nor a teaching credential in the subject they were teaching. In high-poverty schools, the figure was 22%, whereas it was 11% in more affluent schools. The situation was at its worst in math, where fully 1/4 of all classes were taught by an out-of-field teacher. Compliance with state and federal policy requires that schools hire highly qualified teachers, but there are just enough loopholes and misplaced incentives for this to remain a problem today. We'll take a look at some of these loopholes and incentives in just a moment when we ask the question, who causes the teacher shortage? So, teacher shortage is a localized and subject-specific phenomenon. Subject-specific in that there are positions that are difficult to fill in particular subject areas, and localized in that high-poverty schools are hit the hardest by teacher shortage. All of this occurs against the backdrop of a decline in people entering the profession as well. The number of education degrees conferred by American colleges and universities dropped by 22% between 2006 and 2019, despite an overall increase in U.S. university graduates. That is a serious decline. It does not necessarily mean an overall decline in teachers, as there are multiple ways of becoming a credentialed teacher. But it is noteworthy that the traditional route is declining in output. It is also noteworthy that that 22% drop occurred before COVID-19 made in-person teaching a dangerous proposition. The pandemic seems in many ways to have exacerbated what was already a downward trend in teacher retention, with one half of teachers who left the profession after March 2020 and before their scheduled retirement having done so because of COVID. These questions overlap a bit as we've already talked about COVID, which is not a small factor in the current conversation about teacher shortage, but let's take a moment to ask the question nonetheless. Who or what causes teacher shortage? As we've already discussed, teacher preparation programs have been declining since 2006. Since 2020, there have also been fewer applicants to Teach for America, which is a popular alternative pathway into the classroom for aspiring teachers. We'll learn more about TFA in the next several episodes, and I look forward to bringing an interview with a couple of TFA alumni to you in episode 5. The problem is not really that too few people are entering the profession, though, but that too many people are leaving too quickly. Roughly 16% of teachers were leaving their schools and 9% leaving the profession altogether every year leading up to the pandemic. More specific to New York City, 41% of teachers who began their careers in a New York City public school in the 2012 to 2013 school year had left the classroom before completing their 5th year. 41%. In other words, the teacher shortage problem is really a retention problem. If we were to modify our question, then we might ask who or what is sending all of the teachers out of their classrooms? People love to bring up the pay, so it might surprise you to learn that low salaries figure pretty low on the list of reasons people leave the profession. This makes pretty good sense, though, as public teachers, being government employees, generally have access to the salary schedule where they are planning to teach long before they sign a contract. In fact, salary information is so readily available that in a future episode, we will compare the cost of living, salary schedules, and happiness indices in several cities in the US and abroad to determine the best place to take a teaching job. For now, though, it stands to reason that a teacher leaving the profession before retirement would not be leaving because of the low pay, because the low pay is never a surprise. We all enter the profession knowing that it will not make us rich. That said, increasing teacher salaries could be a quick and easy policy solution that we will consider towards the end of the episode when we fix the problem of teacher shortage. The number one cause teachers point to on their way out of the profession, rather, is poor working conditions. When we talk about the poor working conditions teachers face, we're talking about deteriorating facilities, overcrowded schools, inadequate materials, lack of sufficient meeting and planning time, and the absence of professional autonomy and respect, all of which make it difficult or impossible to do the work of teaching. Teachers' job satisfaction fell by 15%, from 59% to 44% between 2009 and 2012, just in time for that cohort of New York City teachers with 41% attrition before the completion of year 5. All of this is to say that an increase in salary might help, but the fastest way to a teacher's heart is not through their wallet, but through the policy decisions that most adequately support them in supporting their students. The who or what of teacher retention, then, would be the policymakers and policies that precipitate poor working conditions. The fact that funding for schools is determined locally and typically tied to property values means that schools serving impoverished communities will themselves also be impoverished. Impoverished schools cannot afford to maintain facilities and tend to have higher student-to-staff ratios. State-mandated high-stakes testing and administrative responses that degrade teacher autonomy leave teachers feeling like cogs in a failing machine as opposed to the thoughtful, creative professionals they might otherwise aspire to be. In New York State, teachers can be made to teach 1 period per day outside of their license area. Though it is not meant to function this way, such an allowance can act as a sort of stopgap, allowing an unqualified teacher to fill in the event of a shortage. Districts use substitute teachers as long-term subs in similar capacities. When temporary measures become permanent fixtures in the educational landscape, they extend the life of the initial problem. If states, districts, and schools had no choice but to find qualified staff on a more permanent basis, they would be forced to hold on to staff and thus might have no choice but to improve working conditions and salaries. With loopholes large enough to float a national school system with 100,000 unfilled vacancies, however, not only will the shortage remain in place, but it will grow exponentially as those of us who remain are made to fill in the gaps. This brings us to our third big question. What are the implications for teachers in the classroom in the midst of a teacher shortage? As a music teacher who taught ELA out of license for 2 years and a former long-term substitute at a school in central Maine, I can speak somewhat from personal experience on the subject of filling in the gaps in the midst of a teacher shortage. There are teachers who enter the profession strictly for the love of teaching. I'm talking about the act of teaching in and of itself and the relationships that the act of teaching fosters with students and with the school community. I personally am not one of these teachers. I do love teaching, and my school community is incredibly important to me. Not just the students, but my colleagues as well. And I do think of myself as a teacher first and foremost. But my teaching doesn't really come alive unless it has something to do with my subject. I got into teaching because I love music, and not the other way around. I don't think I'm alone in that. I've watched math teachers at my school deliver lessons, and I've seen the glimmer in their eye that is indicative of that same feeling. It says something along the lines of, look at this thing I'm about to share with you. It is bigger than both of us. You're not going to even believe how cool it is. If it weren't for that feeling, that experience of being totally enthralled by the stuff I get to teach, I would not have the energy to do this job. And I can say that with some certainty, having taught ELA for a couple of years. I have colleagues who feel the same way about ELA as I do about music. So this is by no means to throw shade on that subject, simply to suggest that we might lose something in a school when we fall back on the plan to fill in teacher shortage gaps with people from outside of a license area. There are rumblings that I might be teaching a math class this year. We are a month out from the start of the school year, and I haven't done math since the CLEP tests I took to earn my plus 30 salary differential, and far longer since I did whatever math I'm likely to have to teach. So that should give you some idea of the situation. But what other option is there in a school that cannot fill a math position, but is allowed by the state to use the teacher for 1 period per day outside of their license area? All of our problems thus far seem to be policy-based, as even the decisions made by administrators are limited by policy. It is possible that policymakers do not solely make things worse for teachers, though, as there are a few policies on the books meant to address teacher shortage, and possibly more on the way. The Teach Grant, for example, was first authorized under the College Cost Reduction and Access Act of 2007. Congress authorized it in response to concerns about growing demand for high-quality teachers in low-income schools. So, what are Teach Grants? TEACH is an acronym. That's news to me. I didn't know that before. It stands for Teacher Education Assistance for College and Higher Education. Anyway, the Teach Grant program provides grants to students who are completing coursework required to begin a career in teaching. As a condition for receiving a Teach Grant, a recipient must teach for at least 4 years in a high-need field at an elementary or secondary school, or in an educational service agency that serves students from low-income families within 8 years of completing their program of study. In this way, Teach Grants stand out from the typical loan forgiveness program because they are grants to help out at the front end of an education. If a recipient does not fulfill the service obligation, however, their Teach Grants are converted to direct unsubsidized loans. From the inception of the program in 2008 to 2019, over 300,000 Teach Grants were dispersed, totaling nearly $938 million. As a recipient of Teach Grants, I can attest to two facts. First of all, Teach Grants covered about a seventh of my tuition. And secondly, the process of certifying one's service obligation is so convoluted that I'm not sure if I've ever done it successfully. So those grants might end up being direct unsubsidized loans for me in the end anyway, even though I have already completed the service obligation. Student loans, of course, are in a COVID grace period until after January of 2022 at the very least. So right now, everything is like a Teach Grant. Future Noah's problems. An interesting source of information related to the Teach Grant program is the Teacher Shortage Area Report, a database maintained by the federal government to which states submit information regarding their subject and grade level specific teacher shortage areas. It can be found at tsa.ed.gov, and essentially anybody looking to work in a high need position can check to see if their license area is one of the high need areas. If so, a Teach Grant or loan forgiveness program might sweeten the deal a bit. In New York State, right now, the high-need subject areas are K-12 bilingual education, 7-12 science, K-12 health, K-6 special education, 5-12 special education, 7-12 career and technical education, K-12 literacy, 7-12 English, 7-12 social studies, and K-12 world languages. So that's one strategy. Identify state by state who is missing from the teaching workforce and attempt to lure those people in by offering small incentives in the front end of the very costly teacher preparation process. I read recently about an interesting thing happening in Oklahoma this year. Education students in Oklahoma will earn a stipend of $3,250 while student teaching. That's another approach that attempts to partially dismantle the financial barrier partially responsible for the teacher shortage. Student teaching is something we all go through in one form or another before we take on the full responsibility of teaching. And I think 99% of teachers would agree that it is absolutely essential to the teacher preparation process. But that doesn't make it any less of a drag to take on a completely unpaid part or full-time job before you are allowed to work for a salary. We will return to student teaching when we solve the teacher shortage problem once and for all at the end of the show. But suffice to say for the moment that Oklahoma's bold step of paying people for their labor, even if it's a pittance, is likely a step in the right direction for addressing their teacher shortage crisis. And we will be interested to follow that program over the next few years. Teach for America and New York City Teaching Fellows are two other programs that address the teacher shortage by lowering the cost barrier to entry into the profession. We will spend more time on these programs in our next episode, all about the different processes involved in becoming a teacher in the New York City public schools. But the main issue with all of these teacher shortage solutions is that they address only one cause of the teacher shortage: the cost of becoming a teacher. As we've already discussed, the working conditions issue tends to be of greater concern to teachers who leave the profession early, and these solutions do nothing to address those working conditions. If anything, lessening the costs of becoming a teacher may result in greater teacher turnover because the teachers in question have made less of an investment in their career and thus have less skin in the game. Teach for America, as probably the best example of this phenomenon, is not designed to produce teachers, but to provide future professionals of other fields with a couple of years of service experience in schools. More on that in episode 5. If these programs are offering a supply of teachers to combat the teacher shortage, but those teachers are even less likely to make it to the 5-year mark than teachers from the traditional teacher preparation pathway, are they really solutions to teacher shortage? Or are they yet another stopgap that delays a more serious, concrete solution to the underlying issues that precipitate teacher shortage? Just a few more programs worth mentioning are specific to the Bronx, where turnover is particularly high, even for New York public school standards. I got hired in April or May prior to beginning my job in September through the Bronx Early Hiring Program. Essentially, schools in the Bronx can begin hiring before the summer hiring frenzy through this program meant to give them the pick of the litter among new hires. This is not a financial incentive, but is rather meant to connect the early career teachers who are most on top of things with the schools who are most in need of teachers who can be on top of things. I'm certain it doesn't always work out that way, but it did for me. As of the past couple of years, there are financial incentives for working in particular subject areas in particular schools, including the hard-to-staff salary differential, which is an extra $7,200 tacked onto your salary if you teach in particular subject areas in schools that are part of the Bronx Plan, and the Teachers of Tomorrow program, which tacks $3,400 per year for up to 4 years onto the salaries of teachers in schools that are Teachers of Tomorrow eligible. These incentives may very well have an impact on the teacher shortage where it is felt most acutely within New York public schools, but will not do much to the teacher shortage trend nationwide unless they are adapted to fit that larger context. Something worth keeping an eye on is President Biden's American Families Plan, which sets aside $9 billion to address the teacher shortage in the U.S. The funding would be used to entice people to study education and enter the field, and allow existing teachers and professionals from other fields easier and less expensive opportunities to obtain certification for particularly in-demand specialties within teaching. So more of the same sort of front-end incentives we've been exploring throughout the episode. Nearly a third of the $9 billion would go toward creating and expanding grow your own programs, which aim, particularly in areas with large populations of students of color, to recruit, develop, and retain teachers who are already in the community, as well as other teacher residency programs. Included among the $9 billion is $1.6 billion to help expand the supply of high-need subject area teachers like special education teachers and bilingual teachers. There is also $2 billion for support programs, like formal mentorship programs for new teachers and teachers of color, aimed at helping keep existing teachers in the field. This contrasts markedly from everything we've examined so far because it is about improving working conditions rather than offering a pay incentive. To further address the shortage of teachers of color, Biden is proposing another $400 million to fund teacher preparation programs at historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, and other minority-serving institutions. This is particularly notable and something of a bookend for us, as we began today's episode with a discussion of how, as barriers to entry started to fall in other careers, women and people of color found the teaching profession less appealing. Nowadays, less than 20% of teachers are people of color, yet U.S. public schools serve a student population that is more than half people of color. The teacher pipeline thus requires re-diversification if students are to have a reasonable chance of learning from teachers who look like them. Now it's time to dream. We have explored the roots of the teacher shortage crisis, and we have all the information in front of us. So now let's consider what we could do to fix the whole thing if we had the ear of policymakers. Let's start inside the school and work our way out, though. Probably the ideal student-to-teacher ratio is 15-1 at the most. Larger classes shouldn't be much larger, and they probably ought to have 2 teachers. Classes for which these ratios do not work are more likely to require a smaller ratio than a larger one. I think you would be hard-pressed to find a teacher in public schools who would disagree with this. This means that one aspect of proper working conditions that will help to prevent teacher shortage is keeping enough teachers in the building to guarantee a proper student-to-teacher ratio. It's something of a catch-22, perhaps, but you have to prevent shortage in order to prevent shortage. Anyway, the classes should take place in buildings with natural light and ventilation. The rooms should be comfortable year-round, regardless of the weather outside. There should be enough comfortable furniture for everybody. There should be enough bathrooms for everybody, and one should be located within a reasonable distance of each and every classroom. There should be enough administrators to support teachers and look after the administrative affairs of the school at the same time. Children should have access to all of the things that they need in order to be successful, like breakfast that has more to it than a bunch of simple carbohydrates and milk, and pencils they don't have to demean themselves in order to obtain in case they used their pencil money for something more essential than pencils but still want to take notes in class. The list of simple things that would make for reasonable working conditions could go on and on, but probably you already have an idea of a ridiculous thing or two that you have encountered in your school. Probably it is the type of thing you could tell your friends from college about for a quick laugh, the type of thing they would never have to deal with as professionals, but the type of thing we deal with all the time in one form or another. It's the type of thing with a price tag on it that could very easily be fixed provided pressure is applied consistently and the connection is made between the teacher shortage crisis and that very thing that would improve working conditions for teachers were it simply fixed. What is that thing for your school? Is it too few bathrooms? Classrooms that do not fit class sizes? Class sizes themselves? How drastically would your working conditions improve if just one or two of those things were fixed? I think often about my friends who are my age, but who are just now starting to practice as doctors. They went to school a little longer than me, but then they had these long apprenticeship periods where they really got to practice the skills that you can't just pick up in a class or a book. They were supervised by masters of their craft, and the safety mechanisms and supports were only very gradually removed so that they couldn't cause any real harm before they had developed their skills sufficiently to be trusted with lives. Then I think about my own induction period. I student taught for a year, and then I had my own classroom. Nobody was there to remove the supports gradually, and nobody checked to make sure I wasn't causing any harm. In fact, I almost certainly was causing harm. There's no way around it. I wasn't doing surgery or anything. There wasn't any blood involved, but teachers have a lot of power, and it takes a certain thoughtfulness to ensure that one is only using that power for good. I could very easily have left the profession after year one. It was the hardest year of my life. I could have left after year two, as that was the second hardest year of my life. It makes sense that teachers don't make it to year 5. If doctors started work the way we do, I'm sure a lot of them wouldn't make it to year 5 either. But they don't. They have internships and residencies. And by the time they're practicing medicine all the way, they would have reached veteran status at my school. So, what would it take for teacher retention to look more like doctor retention? A couple more years of school, an extended induction phase with a lot of support from master teachers. This induction phase, of course, would have to be paid. Otherwise, a teacher's salary would have to look like a doctor's salary to justify the extended period of time with a limited income. I think we solved it. That's it. Okay, so I understand that this might seem like a bit of a reach, but part of Scott Stringer's campaign platform for mayor included putting 2 teachers in every K-5 classroom in New York City and launching the country's largest teacher residency program, which would essentially act as an extended, paid induction period. Scott Stringer was not competitive as a mayoral candidate, but the education planks from his campaign platform do not have to end with him. Part of demanding full funding for schools has to involve improving our working conditions. We do not need more consultants. We need reasonable working conditions, all of which have a price tag. Most of the money needs to go to hiring, training, and holding on to good teachers. And the money going towards those ends right now just isn't cutting it. Now for this week's news update. Mayor de Blasio's plan remains to open all 1,800-some New York City public schools for full-time, 5 days per week instruction on September 13th. All children are expected to attend in person, except for a few children with exemptions based on serious health conditions. The mask mandate in New York City public schools will be in full effect this fall, and as of right now, teachers have to have the shot or submit weekly COVID test results. Randy Weingarten, the president of the AFT, said all teachers should get vaccinated. I agree with her. As of right now, Michael Mulgrew has not issued a statement to that effect. But it's possible that we should be on the lookout for an actual vaccine mandate, hopefully that comes to pass. It is still up in the air what sort of threshold will trigger the closure of a classroom, school, or the entire public school system. It is also unclear how frequently we will have random COVID testing done. Finally, nobody is quite sure what will be done in the schools that are too overcrowded to maintain 3 feet of distance. City officials are suggesting there are about 60 of these schools, which is quite a few, whereas the principals union is suggesting that there are actually over 200, which is fully like 1/9 of all the schools in New York City, or 11%, which is really a lot. If I had to guess, the official guidance will be something along the lines of do your best with what you've got, which is our usual official guidance. All signs point to a return to school on September 13th, though. As our third episode draws to a close, I'd like to take a moment to thank you for spending this half hour with me, and to remind you to reach out with any questions or feedback to professionaldevelopmentpodcast@gmail.com, and I promise I will get back to you. If you like what you're hearing and you want to hear more of it, check us out at patreon.com/professionaldevelopment, or just subscribe wherever you do your podcast listening and leave us 5 stars and or a nice review. Thanks again, and catch you same time, same place next week.